Welcome to Two Lit Ladies, the podcast. The Two Lit Ladies, Dr. Katherine McKnight and Deanna Gallagher, are literacy experts and educators who specialize in developing reading, writing, and literacy skills for all students. Thank you for tuning in.
Hi, I'd like to welcome all of our listeners tonight to Two Lit Ladies. I am Katherine McKnight, and I have a really special guest today for our podcast. It's the wonderful Dr. Jennifer French, who has authored Help My Students Write Like They Text. And I know many educators out there, especially those of you who teach writing, you see this all the time. You'll see abbreviations like LOL, OMG, and you start seeing it in kids' academic writing, formal writing. And chances are you've read many of those terms, like IDK and such. But so what happens there? So as a middle school teacher, Jennifer really was wondering about that when she would see that, and more perplexed when she was seeing that on her students and using text talks on homework and classroom assignments. She really wanted to know how that impacted students' writing. So Dr. Jennifer French, before I take it over, turn it over to her, Jenn is an educator and also the author of her book, published by Rowman and Littlefield, Help My Students Write Like They Text. And she's a teacher, administrator, literacy coach, and a former assistant professor of education. Currently, she's serving as a director of curriculum instruction and assessment for a school district in Indiana, in South Vermilion, Indiana. And she regularly leads schools through that process of curriculum mapping, aligning curriculum to standards, and getting really great literacy practices like the integration of technology into literacy programs. Her experiences have varied from being an elementary literacy specialist and a middle school, high school English teacher, college professor, and student teacher supervisor. So she really has that unique position of understanding theory, research, and putting it into practice. And I'm just going to say on a personal note, I have had the good fortune of working with Jenn in several school districts, and she's just delightful to work with in schools, largely because of her personal, her able to, really connect with colleagues and has great resources. And I always say, being over 50, my first requirement for anybody that I work with is they've got to be funny. And Jenn is a pretty funny and wonderful scholar and thinker and educator. So I'm going to turn it over to Jenn and just say, what were some of the big ahas that you talked about in your book? How does texting impact student writing? And because I know a lot of parents out there too, as well as teachers, kind of bristle about the texting and how it can potentially impact student writing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Hi, Katie. So thanks. So yeah, this all got started as teaching 7th grade English. And I'm checking papers, and for example, one quiz answer was WTF, which, if you know your text speak and your text lingo, what the expletive, right, is a 7th grader's response to a quiz question. And when that same kind of answer shows up on your state standardized writing portion, it makes a teacher start to sweat and gulp and, oh my gosh, how do I do this? And so I went in when I went into my doctorate program, knowing that that's the content that I wanted to research. That's my question. And what can I bring to the world of education is how to stop the demise or the deterioration of the English language that middle schoolers are doing to the English language. So basically I went in with that theory or hypothesis that texting is really diminishing academic or standard English. And what I found was really interesting, and that wasn't the case. And so it brought about the book that I wrote based on that research. And then the strategies that come along with that. And so, if it's not really deteriorating our language, especially in younger children, because if you think about it, if we're going to use text speak or text lingo, it's based on phonetics, and a lot of the foundational the foundational principles of how we create a language, you've got to be able to understand those, and you've got to be able to manipulate those in order to create text speak. And so younger children that have those abilities also have higher functioning literacy, have better spelling, better reading comprehension, better handwriting. It just kind of snowballs and benefits all of their literacy skills overall because they really understand language in order to manipulate it. Whereas middle school kids, it's a little bit different. So depending on the students and how much they text, it can impact their ability to really become fluent in academic language. However, our research shows by the time they reach college age, they have mastered the ability to be able to turn it on and turn it off. And that's where we come up with this whole idea of code switching. So as teachers, what we can do instead of shooting ourselves in the foot, just saying, no to slang and text speak in the classroom, is we show them how to use it correctly. So we show them when we can think in text speak and when we can brainstorm and draft. But then now when we're ready to turn it into an academic paper or essay or a standardized writing portion, we flip that code or flip that switch and write in that academic language.
Yeah. And I think there's of course a lot of folks in literacy and language that have written about, code switching and dialect, right?
Sure.
And I remember, saying to my students all the time is that we speak multiple dialects. I have a dialect that I use when I'm speaking to my children as a mother, a dialect. There's a whole dialect actually and specific language to being a Girl Scout troop leader, or when I go into Starbucks, you have to order your coffee in a certain way. Otherwise they look at you like an idiot. You got to say,
Right.
I want an iced venti non-fat latte, and it has to be in that order with the, descriptors. Otherwise they get a little jumbled. Right.
Mm-hmm.
And, so is this really something else too of just, we have to be deliberate about, that this is another dialect that we speak, and, and giving them the rules for that. These are the rules for, academic language and such. And I taught, in a high school for many years where I was very specific about, these are the rules. This is what academic English is. This is what is expected. Academic English is expected in this, but when we're having classroom discussions, of course, we can use slang and different idiolect. But I used to be very, very precise and specific. And Maxine Green has written about that in Dialectic of Freedom, about, just give me the rules. What are the rules,
Mm-hmm.
For this kind of language or this kind of dialect, right? So what are kind of your thoughts on that? Or
Yeah, I think that's right on, and I think that's the approach that is the best approach to take with kids. And also, sometimes we need to remind teachers of that, because as teachers, when we're just in our classroom, we become very that becomes our universe, and we become very just microscopic on, this is how it has to be, and everyone has to speak in the correct form. When really just reminding, we have all kinds of different dialects. Starbucks is a specific example, and that's a great way to start a lesson. Let's talk about some of the different codes that we use in our life. And then even bring up your text messages. Well, what does a text message to mom look like versus one to a professor or versus one to your girlfriend? And then just kind of looking at the language that's used and then starting that conversation about codes. And then just branching off for there. But yeah, I think the Starbucks is one that's relatable, and it's a great place to start that conversation.
Yeah. And I think the other thing too is that, we're not saying that using texting is bad.
Right.
Not at all. And that's something else too. We don't want to say, oh, your family talks funny, or this isn't the right language to use. Texting is great and efficient for specific contexts. So of course, as literacy educators, as educators, we want kids to expand their repertoire, right? It's different ways to express yourself, but when is it appropriate? And that's always the sticky one as well.
Right. And that's where we have the term negotiating the code. So once students understand that there's a variety of codes, then we negotiate what code is appropriate for what context. So, okay, class, we're getting ready to have this conversation with your classmate. I need you to brainstorm this many ideas for this amount of time. What code is appropriate. And we have that conversation. Well, you can use slang. You can use text speak. Very casual is completely appropriate. Now we need to negotiate the code again when it's time to do, a final term paper. But once they understand those parameters and are able to identify those specific codes, that's where that code switching comes into place. And that's just a great skill. And that's kind of the same approach that we take with EL learners also.
Yeah. And, you and I have talked about this too, is that, the idea of like texting like a symbolic or shorthand is nothing, nothing new. Some of our older educators who might be listening or parents, some of you might remember Gregg Shorthand, right? And that shorthand was actually a class at my high school. You could take shorthand, and we've kind of lost that art because of the technology. But it was used, as a shortcut for taking dictation and highly efficient. But you wouldn't write something in Gregg Shorthand for somebody who didn't know that. And of course, it was always transferred. It was always translated into text into English, into text, in order to make what was dictated public and that sort of thing. So it's nothing really new for us too. And then another one that comes to mind too is Morse code.
Exactly. Right. And we'd also talked about that. Yeah. And Morse code is, and even shorthand, and shorthand's based on eliminating vowels, which were some of the first principles when we started to text was, acronyms, phonetic spelling, elimination of vowels. And all of those are, characteristics of shorthand. And then in the stenograph machine, which is one of the first machines for shorthand, you use your thumbs when you type on it. And so what does that, remind you of? So it's not a new thing. So yeah. once we start, talking about that, we realize it's really not going to ruin our English language. It's just a new thing. And I think if we have a better attitude, a more accepting attitude, and are able to keep that in perspective, it will help our relationship with our students as we try to teach them.
Yeah. Yeah. And that it's not a condemnation, right? And just, you got to know when and how to use it. And then that's your superpower, right? And so the other thing that I really love about your book is that you also offer some really concrete strategies for teachers to help kids with that, to understand when texting is useful, appropriate, and when, academic English is required. So could you highlight for us some, maybe like a couple of examples of what you would suggest to teachers if they come to you and say, just like you're titled, help my students write like they text, I can't seem to break this pattern with them. How do I approach that? So what are some of the great highlights in your book that can help teachers with that?
Yeah. And I think the first part in that conversation into just bringing that into your classroom is the awareness of different registers or codes, like I was talking about, even if you start with the Starbucks conversation. And you can start that with elementary kids when you just start talking about formal versus casual, giving examples of what that looks like. And you don't even have to use that terminology, but just the basic premise of formal versus casual speaking. And you can take it into more depth. And you can use Ruby Payne's work on her 5 registers of language, going from, frozen, formal, consultative, casual, and intimate, and kind of showing them examples of each. And then if you move, her work says that if you move more than 2 registers up or down, it becomes inappropriate. And then she uses the example of, a consultative or a consultative register, speaking with a work coworker. If you move down 2 registers, then you're in the intimate category, and then that's sexual harassment. And so just giving them concrete examples of how important it is to stay within the right register
Mm.
It is a great conversation to have. And then talking about the code switching. And so you can do that by providing, high school freshman Shakespeare, Romeo and Juliet. So let's take this language. We have to deconstruct it, show that we understand it, and then translate that into a different register or different code. How would we text the same thing as Romeo to Juliet? What would that sound like? What would that message be? So I have to understand it, deconstruct it, and be able to translate it, which is higher level thinking. And they're really into that. They get excited about it. They understand it, and something they can have fun with. So those are just a couple of activities to start. But it's basically just deconstructing language and then translating it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And of course we do that all the time,
Mm-hmm.
in academic work and in classrooms, right?
Exactly.
And, I have two thoughts on that. It sounds like Ruby Payne's framework basically was a deepening and a deepened expansion of Maxine Green's assertion of, we have to be deliberate and teach the rules. And Ruby Payne said, well, here's the framework. Here's the framework. Here's kind of the barometer, the scale that you need to maneuver in. So I love that. I love that kind of framework. And then the other thing too, as a literacy nerd too, when we're talking about, taking a text like Romeo and Juliet and playing with the language and using different kinds of dialects or dialects would be the appropriate term with language. The kids are also going into like deeper meanings of text, right? So they can't, just do that. You can't just translate it. They have to really understand and have digested the text into deeper meanings in order to accomplish that.
Yeah, sure. And that's kind of the key thing too, is taking the higher level text. So whether you're working with fifth graders or seniors, it's important just to use that higher level text selection, and then walk them through how to break down text, those breaking down text kind of processes, helping them learn those processes. And then they can apply that to any text. So it really becomes some very valuable tools in approaching literacy.
Yeah. And so what are some of your thoughts too about, like we understand text and its impact on language and student language, written and spoken. But the other thing too is that there's things in texting that, are also kind of limiting too. Inferences for instance, are challenging sometimes to pick up in texting, like texting is more deliberate and concrete. And the other thing I'm thinking about too is that, now it seems with our youngins
Mm-hmm.
that the preference for them now is to text rather than get on a phone. I find, that I have to teach phone etiquette to young folk in my family and just say, this is the etiquette. And I remember seeing a video a long time ago about when the telephone came out, and there was a video, a film on how to use the telephone,
Mm-hmm.
how to dial a phone when the rotary dial came out, and it was an instructional thing. And sometimes I feel like, we need to go back to it of this is how you talk to somebody on the phone as opposed to this is how you talk to somebody in Skype or a video medium or something. So what are kind of your thoughts on that? Because the technology is just really driving language and how it's manifesting. But then again, it's no different with other inventions like telephone, telegraph, and the printing press. So what are kind of your thoughts on that?
Yeah, isn't that interesting? I mean, that's so true. And I even had this conversation the other day with my children in speakerphone etiquette.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And so it's very interesting, the things that you don't think you should have to teach little lessons on. But then, yes, you clearly do. So I completely understand what you're saying. But you brought up an interesting point about kind of inferences and how those can be lost. And that's really a great conversation to have with students because, and that's really where emojis have come in. And so talking about how an emoji can change author's purpose or our interpretation. And so one text and then changing the emoji, how does that change the author's meaning? And so that can also be another great launching pad. And so the book also has some different kind of warm-ups or icebreakers, using text speak or using text language as hooks into as a launch pad into other lessons, like author's purpose or inferences, for example, because that's, might not get kids excited about author's purpose, but you can get them excited about emojis. And what does an emoji mean if I say it this way, or if I say it without an LOL, or what if it's a backhanded comment, but there's an LOL at the end of it? I'm still kind of getting a dig in. And so kind of looking at those and really breaking apart language. So there's a lot of really interesting things that you can do with text speak and emojis.
Yeah. And illustrations and such, and how they enhance written text. And, I'm just kind of laughing here, on the other side of cyberspace here when you're saying that, because, you are among, some of my colleagues who use Bitmoji. And for those of you who don't know what Bitmoji is, you gotta get it, because you can create emojis that look like you, that are an avatar kind of cartoon version of you. And I have, a crowd of women like me, professional women who are older generation, and we Bitmoji all over the place, thinking that we're really hip and cool, like youngins, right? But, I'll get a Bitmoji from you or something like that, and I just burst out laughing, because the meaning, it carries something in the meaning that, may not be conveyed in the text, right? In that particular dialect. And yeah, I think that's such a prescient point that you're bringing there. So, kind of, coming towards like the end of our podcast here, what other kind of words of wisdom, overall big word of wisdom would you like our listeners to get as we, wrap up this podcast?
Mm-hmm. I think the big thing is, and I can speak from personal experience as an English teacher or a lover of language. English teachers especially have we feel like it is our life's work to preserve the English language. And, a seventh grader that comes in and does not spell it correctly or capitalize things or punctuate them, if this just runs rampant, it's going to destroy the universe. And so being able to kind of step back and realize the changes that have taken place throughout language over the history of time. And this is just another part of that. It's part of the evolution of language. And, if we can get a good perspective, it will really change our attitude in going in as we teach our students, that we won't come across negative, that we won't shut them down, because the whole goal is for them to love language. And we want to be able to convey that with our own love of language.
Yeah. Loving language and learning how to manipulate language, for the different purposes. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Jennifer, I just want to thank you so much, Jen, for being part of this podcast and sharing all of your wisdom and your research and resources with our audience. And, for our listeners, again, we'll make sure that we have a link to Jen's book, which is Help My Students Write Like They Text, from Roman and Littlefield. We'll make sure that we have a link in our notes for the podcast. It's a wonderful resource, and Jenn sharing all of her research and wisdom and knowledge really helps us to understand how technology is impacting language and writing of our students in our classrooms. So I just want to thank you again so much for being part of our podcast, Jenn.
Thanks so much, Katie.
All right. And you guys all have a great day, and thank you for all that you do on behalf of students.